I'm Isabella Anderson, 49, and I rose from Navy housing in Norfolk to become Director of Naval Operations Strategy. For 25 years, I gave my time, my credibility, and my name to help Lucas Milton build a career he never could have built alone. But when he knew I was arriving at Naval Station Norfolk and stayed silent while another officer humiliated me at the front desk, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been used, overlooked, or betrayed by someone you kept showing up for? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, respect, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. My father never announced himself anywhere. He didn't have to. The room already knew. I grew up watching him come home in that uniform, Chief Petty Officer anchors on his collar. His cover hung on the hook by the door with the same deliberateness every single time, as if that hook had been placed there specifically for him and deserved to be used correctly. It was 1985, and I was 8 years old, stationed in the hallway of a government-issue house at the edge of Naval Station Norfolk, Virginia, watching a man who had earned the right to walk quietly into any room he entered. He never raised his voice. He never had to explain himself to anyone. He simply arrived, and the room adjusted around him. My mother, Ruth, moved through the kitchen the way she always did, steady, unhurried, aware of everything without seeming to watch anything. But it was my father I studied. I watched the way he smoothed the creases from his sleeve before he even took his jacket off. I watched the way strangers on base straightened when he walked past them, not because they feared him, but because his competence was visible from 20 feet away, and people respond to that, even when they don't realize they're doing it. I filed all of it away without knowing I was filing it. At 8 years old, I didn't have a word for what I was learning. I just understood that authority didn't announce itself. It simply was. And that the people who actually had it were often the ones making the least noise. His name was Gerald Anderson. He would retire as a Master Chief Petty Officer, E9, the highest enlisted grade in the United States Navy, after 24 years of service. I didn't know that in 1985. I just knew he was the most competent person I had ever been in a room with, and that watching him cost me nothing and taught me everything I would spend the next 4 decades proving I already knew. We didn't talk about the Navy at the dinner table the way some families talk about the family business. My father talked about work the way he did everything else, precisely, without embellishment, leaving out the parts that weren't necessary for understanding. He told me once that the rank on your collar tells people where to put you in a room, but the way you use your time tells them whether you belong there. I was probably 10 when he said that. I didn't write it down. I didn't need to. In 1993, I was 16. He was 43, a senior chief petty officer now, EE8, and still active duty. I slid my PSAT scores across the kitchen table toward him one afternoon in October. He looked at them for a long moment, in that particular way of his, where you could not tell from his face whether the result was good or disappointing or simply data. Then he looked at me. He didn't say, "Good job." He said, "Naval Academy or somewhere else?" I said, "The Academy." He nodded once, the way he nodded when a decision had been made, and didn't need to be revisited or celebrated. Then he told me, without drama and without softness, that I would be doing everything the men did, and that some of those men wouldn't like it, and that I needed to decide right now, not later, not when the problem first appeared, but now, at this kitchen table in the fall of 1993, whether that was going to slow me down. I said no. He looked at me for another moment to confirm I meant it. Then he said, "Prove it to yourself first. Nobody else matters yet." I have carried those 2 sentences for 30 years. They are the plainest and most useful thing anyone has ever said to me, and the fact that I needed 49 years of life to fully understand them is not a knock on the sentences. I entered the United States Naval Academy in the summer of 1995. I was 18 years old and had been preparing for this institution for 2 years with the same deliberateness my father brought to hanging his cover on a hook. Plebe Summer is designed to dismantle what you think you know about yourself and stress test what remains. It is physical, mental, and institutional in equal measure, and what it actually reveals, if you survive it with your cognition intact, is exactly who you are when comfort has been removed, and the only thing left to rely on is your own character. I was quiet, observant, and functioned better under pressure than I did at rest. I found that out in week 2, and it has been professionally useful ever since. I also found Lucas Milton in week 2, during a physical training evolution that I will not describe in detail, except to say that it was not an environment favoring composure. He was from Charleston, South Carolina, gregarious, quick-talking, the kind of person who makes 3 friends while standing in formation and somehow remembers all their names by the next morning. We were opposites in nearly every visible way, and we became study partners by the end of the first month because I was consistently ranked higher in the class, and he needed someone to fill in the gaps he had no interest in acknowledging publicly. He was charming about it. He was genuinely funny in the way that people are funny when they are intelligent enough to see the absurdity in things, but not quite disciplined enough to do the work the absurdity demands. I liked him. I want to be clear about that because the rest of the story makes it easy to forget. I liked Lucas Milton for a long time. I tutored him through a tactics module in our junior year that he was quietly failing, and he bought me a coffee afterward, said, "Thank you once," and I thought that was proportionate. I was wrong, but I didn't know it yet. In our senior year, a lieutenant commander named Tom Whitfield came to Annapolis from Naval Station Norfolk to give a guest lecture on intelligence operations. He was 32 years old and already carried himself with the kind of settled authority that takes some people their entire careers to develop and others never manage at all. He made eye contact with me twice during that lecture, once when I asked the sharpest question in the room, which I did not do for his benefit, but because I genuinely wanted to know the answer, and once when I did not react to an offhand remark about women in field operations that made every other female midshipman in the row shift in her seat. After the lecture, he sought me out in the corridor. He looked at me directly, the way people rarely do when they are about to say something that actually matters, and he said, "You're going to be very good at this. Don't let anyone talk you into being something smaller." That was 1997. I was 20 years old. I had just met the second most important man in my career. The first was standing in Norfolk with his cover on the hook by the door, smoothing the creases from his sleeve. Lucas Milton and I graduated from the Naval Academy in May of 1999. We were both commissioned as ensigns, 01, the entry officer grade, and assigned to separate commands on the East Coast. I went to the surface fleet, a cruiser deployment operating out of Norfolk. He went to a different installation further up the coast. We stayed in touch by phone, sporadically, the way that people do when they are both busy becoming the people they are trying to be, and the contact is easy enough that it doesn't require effort to maintain. My first surface assignment was everything it was supposed to be. I was methodical. I earned the respect of my division by working harder than anyone expected and saying less than anyone expected, which is a combination that consistently surprises people and consistently works. I flagged early that my professional interest was in intelligence work. My commanding officer noted it and said nothing further, which in the Navy means the door's open if you choose to walk through it. Milton called when he needed something. He would complain about his commanding officer or his billet or a personality conflict he couldn't navigate on his own. I listened. I asked questions that helped him work through his problems by arriving at his own conclusions, which is a form of support that is invisible precisely because it makes the other person feel like they solved it themselves. I was not conscious of the pattern at the time. I thought we were having conversations. Looking back with the clarity that comes from finally sitting down and actually looking, I was building. He was watching me build and making a mental list of what he would need later. In June of 2002, I transitioned to naval intelligence. When my new commanding officer mentioned an open lieutenant junior grade billet in the intelligence pipeline, I recommended Milton without hesitation. I described his genuine strengths, his social intelligence, his ease with strangers, his ability to build rapport in rooms where others couldn't, and framed them accurately as assets for human intelligence work. The CO made a note. Milton got the billet. He called to say thanks and then immediately asked whether I knew anyone else at the command he should introduce himself to. That was the first thing I gave Lucas Milton that cost me real professional capital. It was not the last. It was not even close to the last. In June of 2002, we sat side by side at a briefing table in a classified facility, two 25-year-old lieutenant junior grades on the first day of their intelligence careers. I was reading the file in front of me. He was watching who else was in the room and calculating what each of those people might eventually be worth to him. I thought we were in the same business. We were, just not the same version of it. Between 2007 and 2022, my career moved in one consistent direction, up. Every promotion arrived on schedule or ahead of it, every billet better than the one before. I was assigned to the Defense Intelligence Agency Joint Task Force in Washington, then to the Pentagon Intelligence Directorate, then to senior leadership at the Office of Naval Intelligence. The work was serious, the stakes were real, and I was, by any objective measure, exactly where I was supposed to be. I had worked for it the way my father had taught me to work for things, quietly, correctly, and without complaint. Lucas Milton's career also moved forward, steadily, reliably, almost always with my fingerprints somewhere on the paperwork. In 2007, I was promoted to Lieutenant Commander, 04. The promotion arrived on schedule, which meant I had been performing above my grade long enough that it felt less like a recognition than a correction of something overdue. The morning after my notification letter arrived, I sat down and wrote the commendation letter for Milton's 04 selection board. I wrote it largely from memory because I knew his service record better than he did. I had been watching it, shaping it, occasionally rescuing it from consequences he didn't see coming until I pointed them out. The letter was accurate and thorough. I sent it without ceremony. Milton called the day it arrived at the board. He said, "Got it! You made me sound like a genius." I said, "I wrote what I know." He laughed, told me he owed me dinner, and pivoted smoothly to a question about his next billet posting. The dinner never happened. When he was selected for Lieutenant Commander 2 months later, his notification email to me contained the words, "We did it." I read that pronoun and sat with it for a second longer than I should have. He had signed one form. I had written every word of the case that got him there. I noted it. I let it go. I had enough to manage without making a project of Lucas Milton's gratitude vocabulary. In 2010, I was 33 and assigned to a joint Pentagon briefing cycle on counterintelligence analysis. I had co-authored a study that a senior rear admiral was presenting to a standing committee. He presented it as his own. I was in the room. My name appeared in a footnote on the 3rd page. When I flagged it afterward to his aide, I was told the admiral would be happy to acknowledge me in the next briefing. He did not. I filed a quiet complaint through proper channels. It went nowhere, as quiet complaints through proper channels often did in that era, particularly when filed by women about men with 2 stars. Milton found out through a mutual colleague and called me, not to express outrage but to assess his own exposure. He asked if I was going to make it a thing, because he didn't want the blowback touching a joint project we were both attached to. He used the phrase, "good, better that way," when I told him I had handled it, internally. He meant it as agreement. It landed as something else. That was the first moment, clear, specific, unmistakable, where he prioritized his own professional comfort over my professional dignity. I noticed. I filed it. I kept moving, because that is what you do when you are building a career inside an institution that was not originally designed with you in mind, and you have made a private decision to succeed within it anyway. In 2016, I was promoted to Captain 06, the senior officer grade. I was now 1 rank above Lucas Milton for the first time in our shared career. At a social gathering shortly after my promotion, Milton made a comment in a circle of male officers, audible, casual, the kind of remark that is designed to land as a joke while doing something sharper underneath. He said that Isabella always lands on her feet, that I was good at reading the room. The men around him chuckled in the way that men chuckle when a comment is doing 2 things at once, and they understand both. It was not a compliment. It was the implication that my career advancement was social rather than substantive, that I had navigated rather than earned. I was across the room. I heard it. I didn't react. I filed it in the same place I filed everything else I was not yet ready to act on. What followed the remark was more revealing than the remark itself. Milton began avoiding joint meetings that would position him visibly below me in the room. He stopped copying me on interagency emails we had previously managed together, citing streamlining when the real motivation was something he would never have named out loud. He didn't stop liking me. He stopped being able to afford me, or more precisely, he stopped being able to afford the version of himself that existed in rooms where I outranked him, because that version required him to acknowledge something he had no intention of acknowledging publicly. In 2018, Milton was promoted to captain. I wrote his endorsement letter, 3 single-spaced pages, specific operations, specific leadership moments, specific outcomes that I knew more intimately than he did, because I had been adjacent to most of them and actively shaping several. It was the strongest professional endorsement I had written for anyone in 20 years. I was standing 2 feet from him at the promotion ceremony. In his remarks, Milton thanked his family, named 3 commanding officers, acknowledged his academy brothers, and said, "Everyone who believed in me, you know who you are." He did not say my name, not once. I applauded with everyone else in the room because that is what you do, and on the drive home, I ran through the complete list of names he had said. None of them had written him a letter. I had written 3 pages. I sat with the question of whether that had been an oversight or a decision, and I arrived at the answer I did not yet want to act on. By 2020, I was a Rear Admiral, lower half, 07, assigned to senior leadership at the Office of Naval Intelligence. By 2022, I had been promoted to Rear Admiral, upper half, 08, 2 full grades above Milton, who remained a captain. In 2022, when Milton needed a lateral move to avoid a career-damaging assignment, he called me. I made 2 phone calls and sent 1 email, and the billet at Naval Station Norfolk was his. He did not thank me formally. He told colleagues in Norfolk that he had worked his Pentagon contacts. I heard about this secondhand through Captain Diane Okafor, who said only, "You should know what's being said." At Norfolk, Milton began socializing with a circle of old guard surface warfare officers, men who came up in an era that predates women in combat roles and had never updated their assumptions. One of those men was a captain named Brad Halverson. I didn't know Halverson's name then. The endorsement letters I had written over 25 years were still face down in the output tray, sitting on the desk of a career that was already more mine than I had admitted. Already a relic. I just hadn't acknowledged it yet. On the morning of October 14th, 2024, I landed at Norfolk International Airport at 0630 hours and took a government car to the base. I was 47 years old, newly confirmed as Director of Naval Operations Strategy, traveling alone, no aide, no escort, nothing that would announce my arrival before I chose to announce it. The briefing with Admiral Tom Whitfield was sensitive enough that it did not appear on the daily base schedule. My arrival had been communicated only through the classified notification system to a handful of cleared personnel. I reviewed my briefing notes on my phone during the drive. The Chesapeake was gray and flat outside the car window. I was not thinking about what was waiting at the front desk. I had been to Naval Station Norfolk more times than I could count in 22 years of naval service, and I had never been stopped at my own front door. I was wearing civilian clothes, a dark blazer, no insignia, nothing visible to indicate anything about who I was or what I carried. The briefing's classification demanded a quiet arrival. That was procedure. I had done it before. It had never required a strategy. I arrived at the headquarters building at approximately 0830 hours. I walked through the main entrance and approached the front desk. The man seated behind it was a captain in surface warfare khakis. He was 55 years old, though I did not know his age or his name at that moment. He had the look of a man working a posting he considered beneath him and redirecting the resentment of that outward toward everyone who walked through his door. He was reading something when I approached and did not look up immediately. When he did, he took in what he saw: civilian clothes, a woman of middle age, no rank visible anywhere on her person, and he made his assessment in under 2 seconds. He did not ask for my identification. He did not ask my name. He did not ask what I needed, or who I was meeting, or whether I had a scheduled appointment. He smirked, a particular kind of smirk I had been cataloging since 1995, and he said, "Wrong building, honey. Try the commissary." Behind him, a young petty officer 3rd class had the morning calendar open on her screen. My name was on it, in classified notation, but present and legible to anyone cleared to read it, which she was. She looked at the back of Halverson's head. Then she looked at my face. She was 23 years old, and 4 enlisted pay grades below the officer, sitting between us, and she went completely still in the way that junior service members go still when they are witnessing something they do not have the authority to stop and do not have the luxury of looking away from. I did not argue with Halverson. I did not introduce myself. I did not ask for a supervisor or raise my voice or give him the opportunity to make this into a confrontation I would have to manage. I looked at him for exactly 1 moment, long enough to confirm what I had seen, short enough to be done with it, and then I turned and walked several feet away from the desk toward the corner of the lobby, and I dialed a number I know by memory. Admiral Tom Whitfield picked up on the second ring. His voice was the voice of a man who answers his phone the same way at 0830 as he does at noon. Present, attentive, without the slight compression that people use when they are annoyed at being interrupted. I did not change my register. I said, "Tom, your desk captain just called me honey and told me to try the commissary. I want his papers by noon." There was a pause. 3 seconds, possibly 4. Then he said, "Done, Admiral." A beat of silence. Then, "I'm sorry, Isabella." I said, "I know, I'll be upstairs in 40 minutes. I ended the call. I stood in the lobby. I did not look at Halverson again. I did not need to. The phone call was not emotional, it was procedural. I was not asking Tom Whitfield for a favor or invoking personal loyalty. I was reporting a security and conduct failure to the appropriate authority, which is what you do when a security and conduct failure occurs. What that man at the desk had done was not simply rude, though it was that, comprehensively. He had failed to verify the identity and clearance of a visitor at a classified command, which is a documented requirement with documented consequences. He had not asked for my credentials. He had looked at a woman in civilian clothes and made a categorical determination without performing a single step of the required procedure. That was not a lapse in courtesy. That was a security failure. Both were true, and both were going into the record. 38 minutes after my call ended, Captain Robert Hale, the base commanding officer, walked into the lobby. Not his aide, not a duty officer. Hale himself, in uniform, moving with the pace of someone who has been told exactly what happened and has no intention of treating it as anything other than what it was. He crossed the lobby floor, introduced himself to me with full military courtesy, and escorted me personally to the elevator. Before he stepped away from the lobby floor, he instructed Master Chief Petty Officer Dennis Grant to relieve Captain Halverson from his post immediately, pending administrative review. Halverson stood up from the desk. He started to speak. Grant said, "Sir, I need you to step away from the desk." Halverson stepped away. The young petty officer third class behind the front desk, her name was Maya Reyes, though I would not learn that until later, watched every step of this without speaking. She did not speak that day, but she did not forget it either. I would learn that in the spring of the following year, when she made a decision about going still that surprised me in the best possible way. Across the building that afternoon, in a classified briefing room on the upper floor, I was sitting at a table with Admiral Whitfield and 3 other flag officers, doing the work I had come to Norfolk to do. I was at the top of the hour, as planned. The briefing was running on schedule. I did not hear the administrative hearing taking place down the hall, processing the end of a 34-year career. I didn't need to hear it. It was being handled. The hearing convened after lunch. Halverson's counsel attempted to characterize the incident as a misunderstanding. The presiding officer informed him that the remark he had made in the lobby was documented, but was not the primary basis for the action being taken. The primary basis was this. He had been the duty officer at a classified command, a visitor had presented at the front desk, and he had failed to perform a single step of the required identification and clearance verification procedure. The accelerated involuntary separation recommendation was approved before the working day ended. 34 years of naval service concluded before dinner. When the hearing documentation crossed Whitfield's desk for signature, his aide brought him one additional item, the classified visitor notification list from that morning. It showed the names of every person who had been informed of my arrival in advance. Among those names, Captain Lucas Milton, Naval Station Norfolk Personnel and Administrative Command. Milton had known I was coming. He had said nothing to anyone. The stranger at the desk, I understood him immediately. I had understood men built on that same architecture my entire career. It was the name on that notification list that I could not stop reading. The hearing ended before dinner. Halverson was processed out before most of the base had started their evening routine. By the time I checked into my hotel room that night, the story was already moving through the informal channels that carry information faster than official communications in any military community. I didn't follow it. I changed out of my civilian clothes, ordered food I would not finish, and sat at the small desk near the window with the notification list printed from my secure phone and the name I could not unknow sitting in the middle of the page where it had no business being and every right to be. I did something I almost never do. I looked backward. Not at Halverson. He was handled. He was done. He was never the story I was actually living. He had been at that desk because the Navy puts people who have nowhere else useful to put them at desks. And he had behaved the way he had always behaved, which is to say, the way the institution had allowed him to behave without consequence, for long enough that he stopped understanding it as a choice. He was a stranger. I had dealt with strangers like him my entire career. What I looked backward at was the 25 years that had produced the name in that notification list, and I tried to see them clearly for the first time, without making the adjustments I had always made to keep the picture manageable and the accounting clean. The room was quiet. Norfolk in October is cool and smells faintly of salt and jet exhaust and the industrial particulars of a working naval installation. I have stayed in that hotel more times than I can count over 22 years of professional visits to Norfolk, and it has never felt like a place I was staying so much as a place I was pausing before moving on to the next thing. That night it felt different. I was not moving on to the next thing. I was sitting with this one. My phone rang. It was Captain Diane Okafor, my executive assistant, my most trusted professional peer, the person who had been telling me things I needed to hear for long enough that I had learned to hear them without bracing for the impact. She had already been briefed through official channels on the broad strokes of the day, the lobby incident, the hearing, the outcome. She called not to debrief me, but to check in, which is a distinction that matters and that she understood without my having to explain it. We talked for 30 minutes. I told her about the notification list, reading her the names in order, so she understood the full geometry of what I was looking at. There was a long pause on her end, the specific pause of someone processing something they suspected and didn't want to be confirmed. Then she said, "How long have you known Milton was a problem?" I said, "Long enough that I don't have an excuse." That was the first time I said it out loud. I had watched the Milton situation develop in slow motion for years. The credit-sharing language that used we when it served him and silence when it didn't. The ceremony where my name was absent. The Norfolk alignment with men I would never have chosen to be near. I had filed each instance and kept moving. I had told myself the dynamic was complicated, that professional loyalty required patience, that I should not evaluate a long relationship in the short term. None of that reasoning was false, exactly, but none of it was the whole truth, and I knew the difference. And I had chosen patience because it was easier than accounting. Okafor arrived at my hotel before 0700 the next morning. She had driven down from Washington overnight, which she did not mention and I did not ask about, because we both understood that this was the kind of thing she did and the kind of thing I needed to allow without comment. She arrived looking exactly the same as she looked at 0700 on an ordinary workday, which is either a gift or a discipline or both, and she ordered coffee and eggs and did not say anything until the food arrived. Then we worked. I laid out the full Milton timeline, the commendations written in 2007, the O4 endorsement written from memory, the Pentagon briefing where my name went into a footnote and Milton's response was to tell me not to make it a thing, the promotion ceremony in 2018 where I stood 2 feet from him and was, "You know who you are," the Norfolk posting I had facilitated with 2 phone calls and 1 email in which he had described to colleagues as working his Pentagon contacts. The notification list, the name on it, the 25 years that had produced that name in that specific place. I did not dramatize any of it. I presented it the way I would present an intelligence assessment on a foreign actor. Here is the data, here is the pattern across time. Here is what the pattern indicates about motivation and decision-making. She listened through all of it without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always respected most about Diane Okafor. She waits until she has heard the whole thing before she says a word. When I finished, the restaurant was quiet around us and the eggs were cold. She said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I need to know exactly what he was told and when he was told it. Then I'll decide." 25 years of intelligence work, and I had never fully run a proper assessment on the person who had been sitting at my own professional table the entire time. The irony of that was not lost on me. I am not sure anything about that breakfast was lost on either of us. A week after the incident, Whitfield called on a secure line. It was not a debrief, the administrative record handled that. It was a private call between two people who had known each other since 1997 and were talking honestly as peers, without the institutional mediation that usually shapes conversations between flag officers about events involving their commands. He told me the command was reviewing all visitor verification procedures. He said accountability would reach multiple levels of the chain. He did not name Milton directly, but he said there were people with sufficient information who made a choice not to use it. That's in the record now, and it'll stay there. I asked whether the Inspector General had been notified. He said the referral was in process. Then he said, I want you to know I'm sorry this happened at my command. I mean that personally, not institutionally. I believed him. That distinction mattered considerably. It was one of the only things in that entire period that did not require revision or qualification when I examined it under the kind of close scrutiny I was applying to everything else. In November, I pulled every document I had ever produced in support of Lucas Milton's career. Commendation letters, endorsement letters, informal advocacy by email, personnel notes written in the margins of selection board files. I spread them across my desk at home in a single sitting in chronological order, and I read each one. They were well written, they were accurate, they were, collectively, 25 years of my professional capital laid out in a line, none of it matched, at any point, by a single substantive document Lucas Milton had ever produced in return. I counted the pages because I am the kind of woman who needs the actual number, not an approximation. The actual number was significant. I was not angry at the letters. I had meant every word I wrote in every one of them. I was angry that I had never, not once in 25 years, asked him to write a single one back. Thanksgiving, I called my father. Gerald was 72 now, slower in the joints, but unchanged in everything that mattered. I told him the whole story, the lobby, the phone call, the hearing, and Milton. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything important. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think you were wrong to wait this long. I started to explain the career, the complications, the professional logic of patience, the ways in which what I had done was not entirely wrong, even if it had gone on too long. He said, I know all that. I'm still right. I did not argue. He was right. He had been right about the things that mattered for as long as I could remember, and he had always had the patience to wait for me to arrive at the same conclusion in my own time. I sat at my desk that night with the last of Milton's endorsement letters face down in the pile. Not shredded, not filed anywhere official. Just done, finished. The account closed not with drama, but with the quiet finality of someone who has finished counting and arrived at a number she now has to live with. Honestly, I did not go to war with Lucas Milton. I did something quieter and more permanent. I stopped returning his messages, stopped putting my name near his in any professional context, stopped making myself available for the conversations where I had always been the one doing the actual work while he generated the appearance of collaboration. At the same time, I submitted a formal request for an institutional protocol review that would change visitor verification procedures at every flag-level command in the United States Navy. One decision was personal, the other was structural. Both mattered. Only one of them would outlast me. Brad Halverson's accelerated involuntary separation was finalized in November of 2024. The permanent record documented the cause. Failure to perform required visitor verification procedures at a classified command, compounded by conduct unbecoming an officer. The remark he had made in the lobby was in the record, not the legal basis for the separation, but present, documented, and permanent. His service was formally closed. He did not appeal. There was no viable basis for appeal, and he knew enough about administrative procedure to understand that. I did not attend the finalization proceedings, did not request notification of the outcome, and did not think about Brad Halverson with any particular frequency after that point. He was never the person I needed to reckon with. He was the symptom. He was out before dinner. What I was still sitting with was the 25-year diagnosis. In December of 2024, I submitted the formal protocol review request. The document was carefully drafted, policy-grounded, procedurally precise, deliberately written to describe the class of systemic failure the Norfolk incident represented without naming the incident by location or date. I routed it through the appropriate directorate rather than my own office, and structured it to survive regardless of my personal involvement in the process. My name appeared as co-signer. Okafor reviewed the final draft and said, This is the thing that actually changes something, I said. That's the point. The changes I cared about were not the ones that would make the news. They were the ones that would make it harder for the next Halverson to operate unchecked, not by punishing him individually, but by removing the structural conditions that had allowed him to function at all. Milton emailed me twice in December. He called twice. The subject line of his first email was, "Checking in." The second was, "Want to make sure you're doing okay." I read both. I did not reply to either. This was not an impulsive decision. I had thought carefully about whether silence was the right response and concluded it was the only proportionate one. I had nothing to say to Lucas Milton that would serve any productive purpose, and I had no interest in giving him the forum to explain, reframe, or contextualize what he had done. He had 25 years to be the person he was not. That account was closed. I did not burn his bridge. I walked off it and did not look back, and by the time I reached the other side, he was still standing on it, waiting for a conversation I had decided not to have. In January of 2025, Milton made the tactical decision that would turn out to be the last consequential one of his career. He drafted a memo to Admiral Whitfield's Chief of Staff, attempting to clarify his role in the visitor notification process on October 14th. The memo was preemptive damage control. He was trying to place his version of events into an official ear before the administrative record fully defined the situation for him. Whitfield's aide read the memo, flagged it to the JAG officer assigned to the ongoing administrative review, and routed it to the Inspector General as a voluntary submission from a named party in the case. Milton had, in attempting to manage his own exposure, handed the Inspector General a document, in his own words, confirming he had possessed advance knowledge of my arrival and had chosen not to act on it. He tried to explain himself to Tom Whitfield's staff. That was the last professional decision Lucas Milton ever made well. In February of 2025, Milton was quietly reassigned to Navy Personnel Command in Millington, Tennessee. A billet with no operational significance, no command authority, and no visibility in any corridor that mattered. It is a particular kind of institutional consequence. Not dismissal, not disgrace in the theatrical sense, but the removal of everything that made a career feel like a career. It is the parking of an officer whose forward movement has ended in the worst possible way. Okafor told me over the phone. She said, "Milton's orders came through. Millington." Yeah, I said, "Okay." I meant it as exactly what it sounded like. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just the quiet acknowledgement that a predictable outcome had arrived. I had stopped being surprised by the mathematics of consequence. A personnel notification arrived in my inbox sometime after that with Milton's forwarding address. I read it, closed the window, and opened the next file on my desk, which was about something else entirely. That is how it ended. Not with fire, with the next file. By the spring of 2025, the institutional machinery I had set in motion was beginning to produce results I could actually see. The protocol review report came back with findings that surprised no one who had been paying close attention and embarrassed nearly everyone who hadn't. 14 major commands. Inconsistent application of the most basic visitor verification standards across the fleet. A structural blind spot, not merely a personnel problem, though individual behavior had certainly lived inside that blind spot and made itself comfortable for years without disturbance. Lucas Milton was in Millington. Through the mutual professional contacts that exist at every level of a career military community, I received occasional secondhand information. He was frustrated, professionally isolated, struggling with the abrupt loss of the network he had spent 25 years building access to through other people's labor. He had reached out to 2 former colleagues seeking professional references. Neither had responded. The word I heard, used by someone who knew both of us, was radioactive. I did not intervene in any direction. I had removed myself from his orbit entirely, and that removal was its own answer. I was not watching him fail. I had finally stopped watching him at all, which is the thing that took the longest to achieve and mattered the most when I finally managed it. The review report was released in the spring of 2025, and 6 of its 8 recommendations were adopted immediately in a directive signed by the Chief of Naval Operations. My name did not appear on the directive's cover page. I had requested that specifically, and the request had been granted without comment. The changes were not about me. They were about the next woman who walks into a lobby in civilian clothes and has every right to be there and should not need to be a rear admiral with a 4-star on speed dial in order to be treated according to basic protocol. I wanted my name off the cover because I wanted the policy to survive me. Personal stories fade with the people who lived them. Directives do not. In the spring of 2025, Petty Officer 3rd Class Maya Reyes submitted a voluntary formal statement to the Command JAG office at Naval Station Norfolk. She described in detail what she had witnessed on October 14, 2024. Halverson's dismissal at the front desk, the complete absence of any verification attempt, and the specifics of the encounter from the perspective of the person standing closest to it. She also documented 3 prior incidents spanning the preceding 18 months in which Halverson had made dismissive or condescending remarks to female visitors at the desk, none of which had been escalated through formal channels. She had witnessed each of them. She had gone still each time, as junior service members do when the power differential makes intervention an unrealistic option. She had not been required to submit the statement. She had not been pressured or offered anything in return. She wrote it because she had been in that lobby on October 14th, and she had gone still, and she had decided that going still once in a lifetime was her limit. Her statement made Halverson's separation unappealable and established conclusively that October 14th was not an isolated incident, but the most recent instance in a documented pattern. She was 23 years old when she went still. She was 24 when she decided not to stay that way. I didn't know yet how much I owed her for making that decision on her own, without anyone asking her to. In June of 2025, I addressed the Surface Warfare Officers School in Newport, Rhode Island. I was invited as Director of Naval Operations Strategy, not as the subject of the Norfolk incident. I accepted without hesitation, and I spent more time preparing for that address than I had for most professional engagements in a long while. I did not tell the Halverson story from the podium. Instead, I spoke about the obligations of rank, not the privileges, the obligations, and what it means to perform at every grade with the same standard of professional conduct you would want applied to your own career and your own family members, at every desk and in every lobby, at every command in the Navy. I spoke in specifics, what verification means procedurally, what courtesy costs institutionally when treated as optional, what it signals to every junior service member watching when a senior officer demonstrates that some visitors are worth verifying and others are not. The room was full of O3s through O6s who had heard about Norfolk through informal channels. They understood what I was actually saying without my having to underline any of it. After the address, a young lieutenant approached me in the corridor. She was nervous in the particular way of junior officers dealing with flag officers outside of formal settings. The math of that interaction is always complicated for people on the lower side of it. She said, "I heard what happened at Norfolk. Is it true you never told him who you were?" I looked at her for a moment. I said, "I didn't have to." She nodded slowly, deliberately, filing it somewhere more permanent than a notebook. That was the clearest version of everything I had spent my career building toward. Authority that requires announcement is borrowed. Authority that doesn't is earned. 25 years of work reduced to 5 words in a corridor in Newport, Rhode Island. It turned out that was exactly enough. After 25 years of extending trust in one direction without adequate return, I discovered that rebuilding it required something I had not prioritized in any of those years: selectivity. I had trusted Lucas Milton because he was familiar, and familiarity had felt like evidence of something when it was only evidence of duration. What I built in the back half of 2025 was different in structure, trust offered deliberately to specific people based on what they had actually demonstrated rather than what proximity suggested they might eventually be. In August of 2025, Okafor flagged a situation involving Petty Officer 3rd Class Maya Reyes. Reyes had been passed over for a shore duty billet she was fully qualified for by every documented standard in the Navy personnel system. The selection board process showed an informal notation questioning her team fit, a phrase with no objective definition, no established criteria, and no standing as a valid selection metric under Navy personnel regulations. I reviewed Reyes's complete service record myself, from the first entry to the most recent. The record was clean in every material respect. Her formal statement documenting what she had witnessed on October 14th was in it, submitted voluntarily at personal professional risk, with no guarantee of any particular outcome. She had, by every measure the service uses to evaluate personnel, done everything correctly and then gone further than she was required to. I did not call anyone. I did not invoke my rank to substitute my judgment for the selection board's judgment. What I did was formally request that the board supervisor produce written documentation of the reasoning behind every decision in the contested selection batch. A procedural requirement that exists precisely for situations where informal judgment has substituted for documented process, and that, once invoked, forces the board to examine its own work in writing. The billet was reopened. Reyes's file went back to the table on its merits. I did not pick up the phone and say, "Give her the billet." I made them read the file they had already decided to set aside. In September of 2025, Maya Reyes was selected for shore duty at a naval installation in San Diego, her home city, a place she had been working toward returning to for 2 years. The selection was on merit. The record made that unambiguous. I learned about it through Okafor, who heard it from a mutual contact at the command. I did not reach out to Reyes directly. I did not need her to know I had been involved, and I had not been involved in any way that required acknowledgement. What mattered was that a fair process had produced a fair result, and she was the beneficiary of a system that had, in this instance, done its job correctly. She got the billet because she earned it. I made sure the process was honest enough to see that clearly. That is all she should have ever needed from anyone in a position to ensure it, and all anyone who has actually earned their standing should ever have to ask. In October, I initiated an informal quarterly lunch. Okafor, myself, and a rotating group of junior female officers from various commands around Washington. Not a program, not a mentorship initiative requiring a budget line or a planning committee. Just lunch at a restaurant where nobody adjusted their behavior based on the stars on the collar, with real food and real conversation. At the October gathering, one of the lieutenants asked me what I would have done differently early in my career. I thought about it for a genuine moment rather than reaching immediately for the comfortable answer. Then I said, I would have asked more people to put their support in writing, and I would have been more careful about whose career I was building with my own hands. I did not elaborate. I did not name Milton. The 3 junior officers at that table were intelligent enough to fill in the context themselves, and they were at exactly the stage of their careers where that information was still actionable rather than simply instructive. In November, Admiral Whitfield sent me a note by hand, delivered by his aide, not emailed, which was a deliberate choice I noticed and appreciated. 2 sentences. He had been watching what I had built since October. The Navy was better for it, and he was proud to know me. I read it twice. I held it up briefly, the way you hold up a photograph to see how it looks in the light, and then I put it in the top drawer of my desk. Not because it didn't mean something, it meant a great deal. But I was learning, slowly and not without effort, how to let things matter, quietly, without needing them displayed, without needing external validation to confirm what I already knew was true about my own work. In December of 2025, the Vice Admiral Selection Board results were published. Lucas Milton's name was not on the list. At 48 years old, having spent the terminal phase of his career at a personnel desk in Millington with no operational relevance and no visible future, he would not advance further. I saw the announcement in the standard personnel digest I read every month. I scrolled past his name. I felt neither satisfaction nor sympathy, only the faint, clean recognition of an outcome that had been mathematically inevitable for long enough that its arrival required no processing. His name was not on the list. I scrolled past it the way you scroll past weather conditions for a city you used to live in and no longer think about unless someone mentions it directly. Then I moved on to the next item on the digest, which was about something else entirely. By January of 2026, my life had a shape I recognized and respected. The directorship was no longer new. It was mine, fully, in the way that things become yours only after you have carried them through difficulty and found them still intact on the other side. The noise from the previous year had settled into institutional change that was becoming the new normal at commands across the fleet. Milton was in Millington. Halverson was a footnote with a LinkedIn profile. The junior officers from the October lunch were applying things I had said without needing me to check in on their progress. And yet something I had not fully accounted for kept surfacing in the quiet moments. Not grief exactly, and not anger, but the particular weight that comes from realizing how much you accepted for how long and how little of it you were ever required to accept in the first place. I arrived before most of the directorate on Tuesday mornings. I made coffee in my office, not the break room, my own office. with the small machine I had brought from home and never replaced because it worked correctly, and I have never seen the logic in changing things that work correctly. I sat at my desk for 12 minutes before opening anything on my calendar or my computer. I did this most mornings now, and I had been doing it long enough that it had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the beginning of the day itself. 12 minutes that belonged to no one. 2 years into the directorship, and this was the clearest evidence of genuine change in my daily life. I had 12 minutes each morning that I did not owe to anyone and had stopped volunteering. I noticed this on a Tuesday in January when I sat there and actually registered what the silence felt like. I thought about how much earlier in my career those 12 minutes would have been spent doing something for someone else's advancement. Then I opened my calendar. The day was full. I was equal to it. In February, the Naval Historical Foundation requested materials for a feature on senior women in naval intelligence. I was one of 3 subjects selected, and I was asked to review and submit my official career file for background reference. I pulled the file and read it for the first time with real attention. Not the cursory scanning I do when I need a specific date, but reading it the way I would read an intelligence assessment on a subject I was trying to understand fully. The file was accurate in every particular. It was also profoundly flat. A list of billets held, promotion dates achieved, commendation citations received. It read as a clean, linear, successful career built in a straight line from ensign to rear admiral over 25 years. Nothing in it captured the year I spent in a Pentagon office adjacent to a senior officer who consistently presented my work as his own. Nothing in it captured the 25 years of endorsement letters written for a man who did not say my name at his own promotion ceremony. The file said I had arrived at every rank on schedule. It did not say what I was carrying when I got there or how much of the weight had belonged to someone who was not me. On March 4th, 2026, I turned 49. I called my father that evening. Gerald was 75, slower in some ways, and unchanged in the ways that matter. He asked how I was sleeping. I paused, genuinely, for longer than I would have paused 12 months earlier, and then I said, "Better. I think I'm finally sleeping like someone who doesn't have anything left to prove." He said, "Good." Then he said, "Your mother used to say you'd get there. I always thought you were already there and just didn't know it yet." I did not answer immediately. I held the phone and let that land in the place it was aimed. That was the closest thing to a benediction I was going to receive from that man, and I knew from 49 years of knowing him exactly how to receive it. Without deflecting it, without minimizing it, without immediately moving on to the next thing. On a Saturday afternoon in April, scrolling through a professional network digest, I encountered Brad Halverson's current profile. He was listed as a physical security consultant at a small private firm in Virginia Beach. I read it for 4 seconds, closed the tab. A few minutes later, I saw, through a mutual contacts activity, an indication that Lucas Milton was considering retirement sometime in the coming year. 3 seconds, closed that tab too. Neither produced any feeling requiring attention or processing. They were information about people who were no longer part of the story I was living. I made a note in my speaking file that I had not yet arrived at the exact sentence I wanted to say at the academy. Then I closed the laptop and went to do something else, which was the most honest thing I could do with that particular Saturday afternoon. On April 5th, 2026, Okafor brought me a formal invitation from the Naval Academy Superintendent. A request to deliver an address at the Women's Leadership Forum on April 12th in Bancroft Hall, Annapolis. I said yes before she finished reading out the room number. Then I sat at my desk with a blank document open on my screen for 20 minutes and wrote nothing at all. I knew what I wanted the address to accomplish. I wanted to give something to 20-year-olds that I had not had at 20. Not a formula, not a success story framed as inspiration, but the specific and honest thing I had needed to hear in 1997 in that corridor at Annapolis, standing in front of a lieutenant commander who had enough integrity to say a difficult thing plainly. I had the room and the date and the audience. What I did not yet have was the sentence that held all of it at once. The cursor blinked. I would find it. I always found it. The finding just always arrived later than I planned and quieter than I expected, which by 49 I had learned to accept as a feature rather than a flaw in how I work. April 12th, 2026. I walked into Bancroft Hall at the United States Naval Academy for the first time in 27 years as anything other than a midshipman, a guest, or a scheduled visitor on someone else's calendar. I arrived by government car, alone, with no aide and no escort. I had booked the car myself, as I always do when I want the arrival to belong to me. I was 20 minutes early. I walked the yard for 15 minutes before going inside, the same ground I had walked as a plebe in 1995, the same Chesapeake light off the water, the same institutional weight of a place that has been teaching people what discipline actually requires since before most of the buildings were constructed. Bancroft Hall in April smells like floor wax, old stone, coffee from somewhere deep in the building, and the particular anticipation of a space that expects something from the people who enter it. I had first smelled that combination when I was 18 years old and terrified in a way I would not have admitted was terror at the time. I was not terrified now. I was 49 years old, I had been doing this for a long time, and I knew who I was as I walked in. Nobody stopped me in the corridor. Nobody asked who I was or where I was going. I found this genuinely funny in a way I had not found anything funny in a while, the particular dark comedy of it. Walking into a building without a name or a rank visible on my jacket, and not a soul in it asking me to account for myself. 27 years later, that was precisely the experience I had been denied in a different lobby by a different officer with a different smirk. Here, it was unremarkable, as it should be, as it should have always been at every command and every building and every front desk in the United States Navy. The Women's Leadership Forum had assembled a room of female midshipmen from multiple class years, plebes through firsties, the full range of the Academy's female officer candidates in one room, which is not something that happened in the same way when I was a plebe and is now sufficiently normal that no one mentions it as notable. I was introduced by Rear Admiral Lower Half Claire Navarro, 42 years old, the Academy's first female dean of academics, a woman whose professional trajectory I had watched from a distance with something I can only describe as quiet pride, the kind you feel for someone doing excellent work in a space that did not originally make room for them and is now having to adjust its architecture to accommodate the reality. Navarro's introduction was brief, accurate, and generous without being sycophantic, which is a balance that is harder to achieve than it appears. She cited my rank and my directorship, and then she said, "Rear Admiral Anderson has spent 25 years making the Navy harder to dismiss and easier to trust. That combination is rare. I'll let her explain how." She sat down. I stood up. The room went quiet in the particular way that happens when people have made a collective decision to actually pay attention, not out of obligation or protocol, but out of genuine interest in what comes next. I spoke for 43 minutes. I did not begin with Norfolk. I began with 1993, with a kitchen table in Navy housing in Norfolk, Virginia, and a man who looked at a set of test scores and asked me a single question, and then, when I answered it, told me to prove it to myself first, because nobody else mattered yet. I told the room what I gave to the Navy over 25 years, honestly, specifically, without the softening that makes professional confessions feel safer, but less true. I told them about the endorsement letters I wrote for 25 years that no one wrote back. I told them what it costs to carry someone else's career alongside your own, and how long it takes to recognize that cost when you have built your identity around being the person who handles things without complaint. Then I told them about the lobby at Naval Station Norfolk, not as a triumph, because it was not a triumph, not exactly. It was a phone call. It was a reckoning, and a lot of paperwork, and a name on a notification list that changed the way I understood a quarter century of my own life. I told them what the call actually felt like in the moment I made it. Not powerful, not vindicating. Correct, that was the word. The single most precise word I had found for it in 17 months of looking. I said, "The thing I want you to take from that morning is not that I won, it's that I didn't have to argue. I knew what I was owed. I knew who to call. I made the call. That's it. 25 years of work is what made that a simple conversation." I paused and let it sit. Then I said, "The phone call you need to make isn't always to an admiral. Sometimes it's to yourself. Telling yourself you deserve to be in the room. That one I didn't make early enough. I'm telling you now so you don't wait as long as I did." The room was completely still. Outside, somewhere beyond the building, the Chesapeake was doing what the Chesapeake does in April, indifferent to everything we think matters inside our buildings and carrying on regardless. In the question period, a second-class midshipman in the third row, dark hair, the forward lean of someone who had been holding a question since approximately the third minute of the address, raised her hand and said, "Were you scared? In the lobby?" I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "No, I was done." She nodded. The room exhaled collectively in the way that rooms exhale when the answer to a question turns out to be exactly what the room needed to hear without having known how to ask for it. A different midshipman, near the back wall, raised her hand and asked, "What would you have done if Admiral Whitfield hadn't picked up?" I said, "He would have picked up." 25 years of being reliable is also what made that a simple call. The room laughed, genuinely, not politely, not the managed laughter of people navigating a social situation, but the real laughter of people who recognized something true when they heard it said plainly. I was surprised to find that I laughed too, not at the question, but at the accumulated rightness of the moment, the particular feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, saying exactly the thing that needed to be said, to exactly the people who needed to hear it first. After the address, after the handshakes and the formal goodbyes and the photographs that people take at these events because they want evidence that a thing happened, a midshipman waited for me at the side door of the hall. She stood there without speaking until everyone else had cleared out of earshot, and then she said, "Thank you." Not for any particular thing, just thank you in the way people say it when they mean something they cannot yet fully articulate. I nodded, and she left, and I did not need to know what specifically she was thanking me for, because that is not what it was about. I was alone in the yard for 4 minutes before my car arrived, standing on the same ground I had stood on in 1995 as a plebe with no rank and nothing yet proven, and in May of 1999 when I received my commission as an ensign and stepped into the rest of my life. The grass was the same, the light off the water was the same. I thought about my father's hands, the deliberate, unhurried way he smoothed his sleeve before taking his jacket off, every single evening, as if that gesture mattered because he had decided it did, and because the things you do with consistent deliberateness accumulate into something that other people recognize without being able to name. I thought about a name on a notification list. I thought about a petty officer third class who had gone still in a lobby and then decided 6 months later that once in a lifetime was her limit. I thought about 12 minutes every Tuesday morning that belonged to no one else. None of it felt like a lesson, it just felt like my life, which is the closest thing to peace I know how to recognize. I didn't just walk away from what was wrong. I walked toward what I had been building all along. It just took me long enough to stop calling it someone else's career. I learned that peace is not the same as silence. It is knowing when your name, your time, and your loyalty are no longer available to people who only take. Have you ever had to choose yourself after years of giving too much? Have you ever realized someone only valued you when you were useful to them? Tell me in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me for more stories about standing up, setting boundaries, and finally knowing your worth.